Fear Schopenhauer. The road from Schelling to Schopenhauer appears to lead backwards. Chronologically, it certainly does. Schopenhauer's chef d'oeuvre, The World as Will and Idea, after all, came out long before Schelling's late emergence. Historically, however, Schopenhauer's philosophy still signifies, all things considered, a more highly developed stage of irrationalism than Schelling's. The following studies are intended to justify this assertion. Why is Schopenhauer's philosophy a more advanced stage of irrationalism than Schelling's? In fine, because it is in Schopenhauer that the purely bourgeois version of irrationalism crops up for the first time, not only within German philosophy, but also on an international scale. With Schelling, it was possible to trace a whole set of ideas which acquired great importance for irrationalism's later forms. Directly, however, as regards his system type in its entirety, his historical influence on the irrationalism of the imperialist age was by no means decisive. The influence of his later period died out after 1848. Only Eduard von Hartmann and his school carried on, with marked modifications, part of what Schelling had begun. And when a reactionary renaissance of classical German philosophy commenced in the imperialist period, Hegel's influence, Hegel, in an appropriately irrationalist reinterpretation, blotted out that of Schelling. The young Schelling exerted an influence only inasmuch as he provided mental tools with which to bring Hegel closer to romantic thought. And when ultra-reactionary romanticism became the heritage that most mattered in pre-fascism and in fascism, Schelling played a subordinate role beside Goris and Adam Muller. It was quite different where Schopenhauer's influence is concerned. As long as German reactionary philosophy pursued a restoration line, albeit one transformed in many respects in the 1840s, he was a wholly forgotten outsider. When the defeat of the 1848 revolution created in Germany a situation that was basically altered in ideological terms as well, Schopenhauer acquired instantaneous fame, dislodging Feuerbach as ideological leader of the bourgeois classes. Richard Wagner's development before and after 1848 is highly typical. In various writings, Engels gives a precise description of this German transformation resulting from the suppression of the 1848 revolution. He wrote, "The monarchy that had been slowly rotting away since 1840 had as its basic determinant the struggle between nobility and bourgeoisie, in which it preserved a balance, the moment that it was no longer a case of protecting the nobility against the inroads of the bourgeoisie, but of protecting all classes of proprietors against the inroads of the working class. The old absolute monarchy had to GG over completely to the political form specially devised for this purpose, Bonapartist monarchy. I have already examined elsewhere this Prussian transition to Bonapartism. What I did not need to stress then, but is now very important, is that this transition was the greatest advance that Prussia made in 1848. Such was the extent to which Prussia had lagged behind modern developments. It was still a semi-feudal state, and Bonapartism is at all events a modern form of government whose precondition is the elimination of feudalism. The Prussians had therefore to make up their rinds to clear away their many feudal remnants and to sacrifice the Junker class as such. Naturally, this occurred in the mildest of forms, and according to the old saying, gently does it. The cause remained and was simply translated from the feudal to the bourgeois dialect. Thus, it was the peculiar destiny of Prussia, at the end of the century, to complete, in the agreeable form of Bonapartism, the bourgeois revolution it had initiated in 1808-13 and taken a stage further in 1848. The abolition of feudalism, put in positive terms, meant the establishing of bourgeois conditions. Legislation took on a bourgeois character to the same extent as the aristocratic privileges lapsed. And here we reach the core of the German bourgeoisie's relationship to the government. We saw that the government was forced to introduce these slow and petty reforms. But it presented each of these small concessions to the bourgeois as a sacrifice made to his class, a concession wrung with difficulty from the crown for which they, the bourgeoisie, had now to concede something in return to the government. The bourgeoisie purchased its gradual social emancipation at the price of the prompt renunciation of political power of its own. Naturally, the main reason inducing the bourgeoisie to accept such a bargain was not fear of the government, but fear of the proletariat. Here Engels is characterizing not only the embourgeoisement of Germany after 1848, but also the crucial specific features of that process, the using of the German bourgeoisie's renunciation, Germany's capitalization, and the constantly growing prominence of capitalist production in Germany to attain to political power. Capitalist production, bourgeois lifestyles, in a country which continued to be ruled by the Hohenzollerns and the Prussian Junkers. That is the quintessence of the change occasioned by the quelling of democratic revolution. And since it was not only the bourgeoisie itself which adopted this course, but also, with few and we may state ever fewer exceptions, the bourgeois intellectuals, it is not surprising that the ideological consequences of this change were necessarily very far-reaching. I have dealt in detail elsewhere with the change in German literary tendencies. 112, philosophically, it reflected the leading part which Schopenhauerian philosophy played among the German bourgeois intelligentsia, especially its so-called elite, a preeminence challenged partly by the vulgarizing representatives of the old materialism, and partly later on by neo-Kantianism. The philosophically decisive trends of the pre-revolutionary age, such as Hegelianism, Feuerbach, and, on the right, Schelling, fell increasingly into oblivion. In the process, Schopenhauer's emergence took on more and more of an international character. For this, too, there were social reasons. Much as the development of the most important European nations differed from Germany's, there still existed in this very respect, during this period, related features of some importance. Not for nothing did Engels call this phase of the Prussian development a Bonapartist one. The position of the French bourgeoisie and bourgeois intellectuals after June 1st, 1848, and their surrender to Napoleon III, created a situation which displays a set of related features, for all the natural differences obtaining. To be sure, the French intellectuals' capitulation to Napoleon III was far less unconditional than that of the Germans to the Hohenzollerns, exhibiting far more serious examples of at least an ideological opposition. The founding of Italian national unity, again, from above, the forms of embourgeoisement in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, indeed even the Victorian era in England resulting from the defeat of the Chartists, all this indicates that, for all its specific national peculiarities, the German development after 1848 still only represents an extreme instance of what was then a universally European development in bourgeois society. Engels draws attention to these common features when analyzing the bourgeoisie's stance to questions of state power under the threat of the working class. 1.1.3. That gives us the social basis for the international influence of Schopenhauerian philosophy, the social basis for an irrationalism founded in the social being of the bourgeoisie. In this second major crisis of bourgeois society, German philosophy assumed the leading role internationally, just as it had done in the first major or crisis at the time of the French Revolution and afterwards. But there was an immense difference. Then, the forward-looking dialectical problems of the epoch were formulated in German philosophy, and chiefly by Hegel. As we have noted, the corresponding irrationalist backlash with Schelling, Baader, and the Romantics was naturally part and parcel of this. And here we can also say that German philosophy at that time was the leading philosophy even in a reactionary sense, in that it captured intellectually certain basic elements of the later irrationalism, whereas most of the counter-revolutionary French and English ideologists, from Burke to Bonald and de Maistre, expressed the legitimist reactionary content essentially in old concepts. German philosophy of this period gained a really international significance, however, through its progressive dialectical evolutionist tendencies. Not for nothing did Cuvier tax his evolutionist adversaries with trying to introduce into science the mystical trends of German natural philosophy. The second crisis, around and after 1848, has an essentially different character. Admittedly, it was just at this time that there arose the most towering peak of German thought, the dialectical and historical materialism of Marx and Engels. But this was a departure from the bourgeois foundation. It marked the final close of the progressive era of bourgeois thought, the working out of the problems of mechanical materialism and idealist dialectics. Bourgeois philosophy's settlement with this lethal instrument, its attempts to go on creating reactionary types of irrationalism on the new ontological basis and in the new ideological situation, belong to a later period. Granted, the philosophy of the later Schelling and still more that of Kierkegaard, as we shall see shortly, was closely linked to the dissolution of Hegelianism, but Kierkegaard's international influence likewise belongs in the imperialist age. Like Schopenhauer's and Nietzsche's philosophy, Kierkegaard's is a kind of anticipation of decadent trends, which later became universal. And let us remark here that it was not until Nietzsche that bourgeois irrationalism began its real defensive struggle against the ideas of socialism. Schopenhauer wrote his most important books at a time when Hegelian philosophy was still enjoying its growth and dominance. His achievement in the history of irrationalism anticipated developments insofar as tendencies found expression in his work which, because of the socio-historical situation just depicted, only became universally dominant after the defeat of the 1848 revolution. Thus it is with Schopenhauer that German philosophy starts to play its full role as the ideological leader of reactionary extremism. Naturally, such an ability to anticipate events indicates a certain intellectual stature. And without doubt, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche possessed considerable philosophical gifts, for instance, a high capacity for abstraction, and not in a formalist sense, but a flair for conceptualizing living phenomena, for building a mental bridge between immediate life and the most abstract idea, and taking with philosophic seriousness phenomena of being which only existed in embryo, as trends which had scarcely begun at the time, and did not become the universal symptoms of an era until decades later. To be sure, and this distinguishes Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche from the truly great philosophers, the vital movement to which they devoted themselves as thinkers, and whose future sweeping power they anticipated, was the rise of bourgeois reaction. For its advent and its growth, as for its crucial symptoms, they had a decided flair, the faculty of intellectual clairvoyance and anticipatory abstraction. If we have called Schopenhauer the first irrationalist, standing on a purely bourgeois foundation, it is not too difficult to perceive the associated personal traits in his social being. His biography distinguishes him quite sharply from all his German predecessors and contemporaries. He was a grand bourgeois, in contrast to the other's petty bourgeois status, which in Fichte's case was even semi-proletarian. Accordingly, Schopenhauer did not experience the normal straits of petty bourgeois German intellectuals, but spent a large part of his youth on J. Orney's all over Europe. After a brief transitional period as a business trainee, he lived a peaceful existence on private means, an existence in which even his university link, the teaching post in Berlin, played a merely episodic role. Thus, he was the first major instance in Germany of a writer with private means, a breed which had become important to the bourgeois literature of capitalistically advanced countries long before. This RNA-terrial freedom from all daily cares provided the basis of Schopenhauer's independence not only from semi-feudal, state-determined conditions of existence, a university career, etc., but also from the intellectual movements connected with them. Thus, it was possible for him to occupy a bornly personal position on all questions without having to make any sacrifices. In this respect, he became a model for Germany's later rebel bourgeois intellectuals. Nietzsche said of him, "What he taught is accomplished. What he lived will stand. Just look at him. He was a slave to no one." Naturally, this independence was an illusion, and one typical of the bourgeois of private means. As a highly practical person with a bourgeois education, Schopenhauer knew perfectly well that his intellectual existence depended on the stability and augmentation of his investments, for which he waged a tough and shrewd battle all his life with his family, the administrators of his fortune, and so on. In these practical features of his character and conduct, he shows a certain affinity with, for instance, important figures of the Enlightenment. This we must briefly examine, because, as we shall see, it also extended to intellectual matters and is characteristic of Schopenhauer's way of thinking. Voltaire, too, battled unceasingly to attain a complete independence, in his case from feudal and courtly patronage. He did so, however, not only on behalf of his individual productive work, but so as to be able to make a stand as an independent intellectual force against feudal absolutism in respect of all the important topical issues. With Schopenhauer, we find not the slightest sign of such a relation to public life. His independence was that of the self-willed, sheerly egotistic eccentric who uses it to retire from public life completely and to free himself of all obligations existing towards it. Schopenhauer's striving for independence thus bears only a formal resemblance to Voltaire's and has nothing in common with it intrinsically, not to mention the heroic struggles which Diderot or Lessing say waged with contemporary reactionary powers for their intellectual independence and freedom to serve social progress. We needed to sketch in these biographical features because they rapidly lead us to the heart of Schopenhauer's specific type of bourgeois existence. Schopenhauer expressed very lucidly what he understood by independence. For, "I thank God every morning that I do not need to concern myself with the Roman Empire, has always been my motto," he said, scornfully referring to Hegel's adulation of the state as the worst Philistinism, whereby men are consumed in state service. According to this outlook, the official and the human being were one and the same. It was a downright apotheosis of Philistinism. Undoubtedly, Schopenhauer's scornful criticism caught the really weak aspects of Hegelian philosophy of right and ethics. Hegel's progressive ideal of the citoyen was to be embodied in the wretched German reality, and because of the way his system was constructed, this incorporation was bound to mean a marked adjustment to the wretched condition of contemporary Prussian society. So such an equating of state citizenship and state officialdom did indeed give expression to that Philistinism from which, to quote Engels, not even the greatest Germans, including Goethe and Hegel, succeeded in escaping. So far, therefore, this Schopenhauerian critique of Hegel finds its target. But what of its author's independence, supposedly a state rising above Philistinism? Let us mention only in passing that the Faust quotation which Schopenhauer includes in his political credo appears in Goethe's original context as a statement characteristic of precisely the petty bourgeoisie. More important is the consideration that Schopenhauer's high-minded withdrawal from all politics was only how he behaved in normal times, when state machinery automatically safeguarded the fortunes and incomes of private investors against any possible attack. But there were times, and Schopenhauer experienced them in 1848, when this automatic protection of fortunes was thrown in question, or at least, as then in Germany appeared to be. At such moments, Schopenhauer's aloof independence vanished, and our philosopher made haste to hand his opera glasses to a Prussian officer for a better view of the rioters at whom he was shooting. And it was assuredly with memories of this major scare in his life that he wrote a will making his universal heir the fund set up in Berlin to support Prussian soldiers invalided in the riots and insurrections of the years 1848 and 1849, in the name of maintaining and establishing law and order in Germany, as also the surviving relatives of those who fell in those struggles. 115 Thomas Mann, a great admirer of Schopenhauer from his youth onwards, calls the motto we have quoted a true Philistinism and sluggishness, a slogan whose adoption by an intellectual wrestler like Schopenhauer is hardly comprehensible. 116 here. Thomas Mann was mistaken. With Schopenhauer, certainly this attitude manifests itself in a grotesque and scurrilous form, but in its social essence it was typical of the bourgeois intelligentsia. Indeed, we may say that it becomes increasingly typical as capitalism develops. Thomas Mann himself, speaking of the older Richard Wagner, who was decisively influenced by Schopenhauer ideologically, calls this attitude Machtbegegsputzte Innerlichkeit. 117. This accurately characterized the new decadent form of bourgeois individualism, as opposed to the economic, political, and cultural individualism of the period of bourgeois ascendancy. The latter form, in line with the structure of bourgeois society at that time, was the philosophy of a personal activity, ultimately calculated, just by dint of its personal nature, to promote the social aims and ends of the bourgeois class. From Machiavelli and Rabelais, via the economic theories of Adam Smith and Ricardo, to Hegel's List der Vernunft, bourgeois intellectual edifices express such an individualism in a historically conditioned variety of forms. Not before Schopenhauer is the individuum inflated into an absolute end in itself. The individual's activity now becomes detached from its social basis, turning purely inwards and cultivating one's own private peculiarities and wishes as absolute values. To be sure, as was evident in Schopenhauer in a most drastic form, this self-sufficiency exists only in the decadently bourgeois individual's imagination. The puffing up into an end in itself of purportedly self-sufficient individuality cannot alter, let alone annul, a single social commitment. And in a critical case such as Schopenhauer's in 1848, we find that this aloof self-sufficiency of the private person is only a decadently heightened version of normal capitalist egotism. Any capitalist, any man of private means would have behaved like Schopenhauer, only without adding to this axiomatic defense of one's own capital a subtly constructed philosophical system. That is by no means to say that such a system, seen also from the social angle, is immaterial. On the contrary, the farther the bourgeoisie's decadent tendencies go, the less it puts up a struggle against the relics of feudalism, and the stronger its alliance with the reactionary powers becomes, the greater will be the importance of thinkers of Schopenhauer's ilk to the cultivation of bourgeois decadence, even when, or rather precisely when, the bourgeoisie itself has only this aforementioned basis of being in common with such thinkers. Precisely when bourgeois intellectuals, within the ideological scope this life basis affords, view the status quo in an extremely critical light. For decadent tendencies necessarily entail the incipient shaking of the faith shown by the bourgeoisie's retainers in their own social system, and even the faith of many actual members of the class. Philosophy will now have the objectively social class task of plugging the resulting gaps, or indeed of bridging the newly apparent gulfs ideologically. This is the task of that body of writing which Marx liked to term the apologetics of capitalism. 118. In general, these tendencies became dominant after the quelling of the 184-8 revolution in Germany, although of course they first set in earlier. Their fundamental character finds expression in their attempts to eliminate intellectually the capitalist system's increasingly salient contradictions by proving all that is contradictory, bad, and horrible about capitalism to be mere illusion or a temporary, removable surface blemish. Schopenhauer's originality lies in the fact that at a time when this ordinary form of apologetics had not yet even developed fully, let alone become the leading trend in bourgeois thinking, he had already found the later, higher form of capitalist apologetics, indirect apologetics. How do we formulate its essence in a nutshell? Whereas direct apologetics was at pains to fudge the contradictions in the capitalist system, to refute them with sophistry and to be rid of them, indirect apologetics proceeded from these very contradictions, acknowledging their existence and their irrefutability as facts, while nonetheless putting an interpretation on them, which helped to confirm capitalism. Whereas direct apologetics was at pains to depict capitalism as the best of all orders, as the last outstanding peak in mankind's evolution, indirect apologetics crudely elaborated the bad sides, the atrocities of capitalism, but explained them as attributes not of capitalism, but of all human existence and existence in general. From this it necessarily follows that a struggle against these atrocities not only appears doomed from the start, but signifies an absurdity, viz. A self-dissolution of the essentially human. This brings us to the center of Schopenhauer's philosophy, his pessimism. It was directly through his pessimism that Schopenhauer became the leading thinker of the second half of the 19th century. Through it he founded the new type of apologetics. To be sure, he did no more than lay the foundations. Later, and particularly when dealing with Nietzsche, we shall see that the Schopenhauerian form of indirect apologetics represents only the initial stage of this philosophical genre. The chief reason for this was that its conclusion, the abstention from all social activity, and certainly from any effort to change society, sufficed only to answer the needs of the pre-imperialist bourgeoisie. It sufficed only during a period when, because of the universal economic boom, this rejection of political activity matched the position of the class struggles and the needs of the ruling class. The social task which reactionary philosophy was set in the imperialist period went further, although this trend was far from dying out altogether. Now the task was to mobilize active support for imperialism. In this direction Nietzsche surpassed Schopenhauer, although as an indirect apologist at a riper stage, he remained his pupil and continuation in the methodological sense. So pessimism means primarily a philosophical rationale of the absurdity of all political activity. That was the social function of this stage in indirect apologetics. In order to reach this conclusion, the chief necessity is to devalue society and history philosophically. If there is an evolution in nature, and if this evolution climaxes in man and his culture, it will necessarily follow that the meaning of even the most individual action and the most individual conduct must be somehow connected with this evolution of the human race. However idealistically distorted this link may be, and however much it may concentrate upon purely ideological activities, meaningful action will still be inseparably linked with man's social and historical life, and, through the medium of the latter, with some kind of concept of progress. These connections can be found, for example, in Schiller's philosophy of art, and we shall see how Schopenhauer's high estimation of the aesthetic and philosophic attitude is diametrically opposed to Schiller's and Goethe's. So if action is devalued, a world outlook is bound to arise, in which all historicity is diminished to an illusion and deception, in which society is depicted as a superficiality, interfering with the essence and obscuring knowledge of it instead of giving expression to it, an illusion in the sense of delusion. Only when the new irrationalism is able to carry out this destruction will its pessimism be able to have the effect and achieve the social task on the bourgeoisie's behalf, which Schopenhauer's philosophy did in fact accomplish in the second half of the 19th century. But we have not yet fully circumscribed the function of Schopenhauerian pessimism. Optimism and pessimism in general are among the vaguest expressions in traditional philosophical terminology, and one cannot analyze them concretely at all without discovering the class background behind the affirmation or denial of a particular development. Without some such concretization, optimism will be equated with embellishing the facts, and pessimism with a stop-at-nothing disclosure of the dark sides of reality, as so often occurs in Bourdieu's historical accounts after Schopenhauer. The French economic historian Charles Gide, for instance, calls the classic author of bourgeois political economy, Ricardo, a pessimist merely because he freely investigates capitalism in its negative aspects as well, although there is not a trace of pessimism in Ricardo's perspective. Or again, Schopenhauer himself regarded Voltaire as an ally, because he ridiculed Leibniz's rose-tinted conception of the best of all possible worlds with devastating irony, although in respect of his perspective of social evolution, Voltaire was anything but a pessimist. It is evident that Schopenhauerian pessimism was an ideological reproduction of the Restoration Age. The French Revolution, the Napoleonic era, and the wars of liberation were past, and for decades the whole Western world had been in the throes of constant upheaval. But in the end, everything remained as before, at least on the directly visible face of things. During and after these major events, the German bourgeoisie lived in the same lack of class consciousness before. Anyone lacking a perspective of human evolution, apart from that wrested from this social misery, was easily convinced that all historical endeavors were fruitless, especially if one approached the question from the bourgeois individual's standpoint and made the crux of it the question, how does all this affect my personal life? And whereas at the time of the French Revolution, the international outlook could offer a perspective pointing far beyond the German misère, the futility of a historical transformation of human life was now presented as a universal destiny. So whereas Herder and Forster, Hölderlin and Hegel managed to obtain a guideline for appraising Germany, possibly condemnatory but offering perspectives, from the international outlook, Schopenhauer's cosmopolitan purview engendered a philosophical generalizing of the German plight. Its projection into the cosmic realm was an important basic part of his pessimism. The other component part of pessimism, whose personal class roots we have already located, is bourgeois individualistic egotism. It is self-evident and common knowledge that there can be no bourgeois ideology in which this egotism does not play an important role. However, as long as the bourgeoisie was fighting feudalism and absolute monarchy as a revolutionary class, this egotism always appeared in close, albeit problematic, association with the progressive aims which the class entertained of reforming society. All bourgeois ideologists face the problem of how to reconcile this egotism, which, in their inability to fathom the historically transitory character of bourgeois society, they viewed as a general anthropological attribute, with social life and the progress of society as a whole. Here we cannot undertake to give even a rough sketch of the various views emerging from Mandeville's ironic critique of society to the dualism of Adam Smith's economics and ethics, the Enlightenment's rational egotism, Kant's ungesellige Geselligkeit, and Hegel's List der Vernunft. Here it suffices to establish this general connection between them. To be sure, a certain change began to occur in England after the so-styled Glorious Revolution of 1688. This era's theoreticians were already starting to work out a code of ethics for the victorious bourgeois, the master of bourgeois society, and to glorify bourgeois forms of life from the standpoint of their stabilization. And since, by virtue of the character of the Glorious Revolution, this was a compromise with the remnants of feudalism, there now came about a weakening of the former revolutionary impulse and ruthless criticism of society, inasmuch as the accent began to shift from the social nature of action towards the bourgeois individual's contented self-sufficiency as a private person. No wonder this provided Schopenhauer with certain pegs for his views. It is notable in the context of the history of philosophy in general, and proof of the purely bourgeois nature of his philosophy, that he, in contrast to the Restoration period's romantic thinkers, who to a man were sharply opposed to the whole Enlightenment, was generally in sympathy with the Enlightenment minds. In appearance, this line runs parallel with that of German classicism, which provided in Goethe and Hegel a continuation, a dialectical extension of Enlightenment tendencies. But this is only apparently so. For Schopenhauer did not want to cultivate the Enlightenment's forward-looking tendencies, i.e., to continue the Enlightenment struggle to abolish the relics of feudalism under the post-revolutionary period's new conditions. Instead, he sought support from the Enlightenment thinkers for the ultra-radical philosophical formulation of the bourgeois individual's self-sufficiency. Thus, when he seemingly coincides with certain Enlightenment tendencies and singles out its representatives for praise, in contrast to Romantic thinkers, this constitutes a reactionary distortion of Enlightenment tendencies, including the aforesaid tendencies found in 18th century England. Later, we shall also find the same distortion with Nietzsche, in the form of his sympathy with such French moralists as La Rochefoucauld and even Voltaire, a distortion equally expressing a falsification of those Enlightenment thinkers' true tendencies, albeit at a more highly advanced stage of reaction. To be sure, and this is another expression of Schopenhauer's indirect apologetics, he represents ordinary bourgeois egotism as morally negative, but not as socially negative, and therefore not as an attribute and tendency to be changed in socio-ethical terms. With Schopenhauer, ordinary bourgeois egotism is an unalterable cosmic attribute of man in general. It is, moreover, the unalterable cosmic attribute of each existence. From his epistemology and worldview, with whose foundations we shall concern ourselves later from the theoretical angle, Schopenhauer derived the cosmic necessity of the capitalist type of ruthless egotism as follows. Hence, each person wants everything for himself, wants to possess or at least to control everything, and would like to stamp out everything which offers resistance. In addition, where percipient beings are concerned, the individual is the transmitter of the percipient subject, and the latter the world's transmitter, i.e., the whole of nature outside of him, and hence all other individuals as well, exists only in his idea, and he is always only conscious of it as his idea. Hence, only immediately and as something which is independent of his own essence and existence, since the world necessarily escapes him along with his consciousness, i.e., its being and non-being become synonymous and indistinguishable. Nature, which is everywhere voracious at all times herself, provides him with this knowledge, with simple and immediate certainty, in the raw and independently of all reflection. The two necessary conditions we have stated will now explain why each individual, although disappearing completely in the unbounded world and reduced to naught, still makes himself the center of the world and considers his own existence and welfare before all else. Indeed is willing, from the natural standpoint, to sacrifice everything else to these and to destroy the world just so as to preserve his own self, that drop in the ocean, a little longer. This frame of mind is the egotism essential to everything that is found in nature. 1.9. It now appears as if Schopenhauerian morality transcends this egotism and negates it. But with Schopenhauer, the dismissal of conventional, cosmically inflated bourgeois egotism is similarly enacted in the individual spiritually isolated from society, and it even marks a heightening of this isolation. From aesthetic enjoyment to saintly asceticism, the individual's pure self-sufficiency is celebrated more and more in Schopenhauer's professed surmounting of egotism as the only exemplary moral attitude. To be sure, this elevated egotism was meant to appear in sharp contrast to ordinary egotism, a turning away from illusion and the veil of Maya in which conventional egotism is bogged down. It is presented as a sympathy with all created things, resulting from the insight that individuation is only an illusion, and one that conceals the unity of all existence. This contrast, which Schopenhauer draws between two types of egotism, is one of the subtlest features of his indirect apologetics. Firstly, he bestows on this attitude the sanction of aristocratic perspicacity, as opposed to the plebeian's blind attachment to the world of phenomena. Secondly, this elevation above ordinary egotism entails no obligations on account of its sublime, mystico-cosmic generality. It discredits social obligations and replaces them with empty emotional promptings, sentimentalities, which may on occasion be reconciled with the greatest crimes against society. In the excellent Soviet film, Chapayev, the bestially cruel counter-revolutionary general keeps a canary, feels cosmic ally united with it, in the true spirit of Schopenhauer, and plays Beethoven sonatas in his leisure time, thus fulfilling all the sublime commandments of Schopenhauerian morality. Schopenhauer's own behavior, which we have discussed already, also belongs in this category. To be sure, the philosopher clears himself in advance of any accusation that might be leveled against him in this respect. Once again, he is a very modern moral reformer, in that he avows that the morality which he himself has propounded and argued philosophically places no obligation on himself. In general, it is a strange thing to ask of a moralist that he should commend no virtue unless he possesses it himself. 120. This guarantees the decadent bourgeois intelligentsia the maximum of spiritual and moral ease. It has at its disposal a morality liberating it from all social duties and elevating it to a sublime height above the blind, uncomprehending riffraff, but a morality whose very founder exempts the intelligentsia from obeying it. Schopenhauer, and in this he was acting quite consistently, arranged his whole way of life with this convenience in mind. We now have an outline, an important example, a long effective model of bourgeois ethics in the period of decline. Admittedly, what Schopenhauer initiated in this dualistic and undemanding form his successors, and chiefly Nietzsche, carried on with a view to liberating through ethics all men's bad, anti-social and anti-human instincts, giving them a moral sanction and proclaiming them to be, if not always, commandments, then at least the prescribed fate of man, i.e. of the bourgeois citizen and bourgeois intellectual of the imperialist age. Here we see quite plainly the resemblance and the difference between Schopenhauer and the irrationalist philosophy of the Restoration era. Both sought to educate their followers in a social passivity. The latter, however, stigmatized all revolutionary upheavals as inorganic, merely fabricated, and diabolical by glorifying as the will of God the organic growth of society, i.e., the exclusive justification of the feudal absolutist order. Schopenhauer, on the other hand, presents the irrationalism of society and history as a pure, naked absurdity, and the endeavor to participate in the life of society, or even to change it, as so lacking in insight with regard to the essence of the world to verge on a criminal act. Schopenhauer, therefore, defends the established order as firmly as feudal or semi-feudal irrationalism defended the Restoration, but with a totally contrary, bourgeois method of indirect apologetics. Whereas the Restoration ideologists defended the concrete feudal absolutist social order of their day, Schopenhauer's philosophy was an ideological safeguard for any existing social order capable of effectively defending bourgeois private property. Thus, Schopenhauer's bourgeois nature is expressed in just the fact that for him, given adequate protection of private property, the political character of the ruling system is totally irrelevant. In the commentaries he wrote to his main work in Parerga and Paralipomena, Schopenhauer voices this standpoint even more clearly than in the main work. Everywhere and always there has been much dissatisfaction with governments, laws, and public institutions, but this is largely so only because we are always ready to tax these with misery inseparably attached to human existence itself, since the latter is, to speak in mythical terms, the curse laid on Adam and his entire race with him. Never, though, has that false impression been promoted with more hypocrisy and audacity than by the demagogues of Etzeit. For these, being enemies of Christianity, are optimists. The world is their end in itself, and hence in itself, i.e., according to its natural disposition, it is quite excellently arranged, a proper haven of happiness. The colossal evils of the world that cry out against this view, these demagogues ascribe entirely to governments. If, they argue, our governments were to do as they are supposed to, we would have a heaven on earth. That is to say, everyone would be able to eat his fill, to drink, to propagate himself, and to expire without sweat and tears. For this is a paraphrase of their end in itself and the goal of the unending progress of mankind, which they tirelessly proclaim in pompous catchphrases. 121. It is clear from these statements wherein the social significance and function of Schopenhauer's pessimism lies, and why he stigmatized optimism, in his main work, as intellectually and morally wicked. There he writes, "Here, by the way, I cannot refrain from stating that optimism, if not the thoughtless babble of men who have nothing but words in their thick skulls, seems to me not only an absurd, but also a downright ruthless way of thinking, a bitter mockery of mankind's untold sufferings." 122. The resemblance and difference we have described between Schopenhauer and irrationalist Restoration philosophy is most clearly expressed in the stance which each adopted to the religious question. We have already examined this problem in dealing with Schelling. As we have seen, the general philosophical struggle in Germany was not between materialist atheism and religion. The extremely shaky and irresolute tendency towards eliminating religious elements from the philosophical world picture concentrated upon the problem of pantheism. On the one hand, this could never really overcome the religious outlook on account of its idealist foundation. On the other hand, its tendency to explain the world from its own premises evoked, as we have also noted, the resistance of philosophical reaction, and it was repeatedly denounced as atheism. Not until the dissolution of Hegelianism did Feuerbach, as has been likewise noted, come forward with a left critique of pantheism by taking apart the religio-theistic restrictedness of classical German philosophy from the standpoint of an atheistic materialism. Schopenhauer perceived very clearly the inadequacy and inconsistency of all pantheism. In the main, my only objection to pantheism is that it does not tell us anything. To call the world God is not to explain it, but only to enrich the language with a superfluous synonym for the word world. It is all the same whether you say the world is God or the world is the world. But he also saw the other side of the coin, pantheism's connection with theistic religion. In this context, he had this to add to the remarks just quoted. For only insofar we proct, ed from a God, thus taking God for granted, and enjoying familiarity with God, can we finally reach the point of identifying him with the world, which we do real in order to oust God in a respectable manner. 123. Here Schopenhauer apparently approaches Feuerbach's critique of Spinoza and classical German philosophy, only apparently though. For in the latter, Spinoza especially, pantheism was in its principal tendency really orally a polite atheism. Granted, Schopenhauer likewise avowed allegiance to atheism, but again he gave it a distinctive accent. It does not mean the destruction of religion and the religious life, as for the great materialists of the 17th and 18th centuries, and it does not even show an unconscious striving in this direction, as with the progressive idealist pantheists. It was meant, on the contrary, to serve as a substitute for religion, to create a new atheistic religion for those who had lost their old religious faith as a result of social evolution and progress in the knowledge of nature. Accordingly, Schopenhauer's atheism not only failed to bear any relation to materialism, the substance of it, on the contrary, was a most bitter struggle against materialism, a diversion of the incipient anti-religious trends away from materialist atheism and their redirecting towards a religious life without God, a religious atheism. Schopenhauer wrote on this subject, "But do the gentlemen know what times we are living in? An epoch has commenced that has long been foretold. The church is rocking so heavily that it is doubtful whether it can regain its balance, for faith has gone missing. The number of those whom a certain degree and breadth of knowledge has rendered incapable of faith has swelled considerably. This attests to the universal dissemination of coarse rationalism, whose bulldog features are growing more and more widespread. It is quite calmly preparing to measure with its tailor's yardstick the profound mysteries of Christianity, over which the centuries have brooded and quarreled, and imagines itself to be marvelously clever. Above all, the central Christian dogma, the doctrine of original sin, has become a risible plaything for the level-headed rationalists. That is because they think that nothing is clearer and surer than that each man's existence begins at his birth. Hence, he cannot possibly have entered the world in a state of guilt. How acute of them! And just as wolves will start to prowl when poverty and neglect take hold of a village, so an ever-lurking materialism will raise its head in these conditions and assume control along with its companion, bestiality. 124. A notable thing about these statements in the negative sense is that they accept the religious crisis as a fact, yet contain a sharp polemic exclusively attacking coarse rationalism and materialism. And in a positive respect, we should note that here, as in many other key passages in his philosophy, Schopenhauer sides with the Christian dogma of original sin. Thus, it is only logical of him repeatedly to stress the novelty and timely nature, in principle, of his religious atheism. He characterized the pre-Kantian situation thus. Up to Kant, there existed a real dilemma between materialism and theism, i.e. between the supposition that blind chance brought the world into being, or an intelligence ordering it from outside, according to ends and concepts, nihque debater tertium. Hence, atheism and materialism were the same. Now Kant, he argues, prompted the following change. But the validity of that disjunctive major term in the proposition, that dilemma between materialism and theism, rests on the hypothesis that the world presented to us is that of things in themselves, and that consequently there is no other order of things than the empirical order. Thus Kant, in removing the basis of theism through his important distinction between phenomenon and thing, opened up an avenue to quite different and more profound accounts of existence. In 125, so Kant was the means of opening up the way out of this dilemma, the path to Schopenhauer's religious atheism, which had materialism as its principal target and adopted a great deal from Christian ethics, remodeling its arguments. From this it is already clearly discernible where the essence of Schopenhauer's religious atheism is located. It is a kind of religious substitute for those no longer able to believe in the dogmatic religions. It offers them a worldview matching scientific requirements on the one hand and metaphysical needs on the other, a worldview broadly accommodating the lingering emotional attachment to religious or semi-religious prejudices. Whereas pantheism, albeit idealistically entangled with its world immanence and, in classical German philosophy, its theory of evolution, led objectively away from the religious worldviews, Schopenhauer's overtly atheistic philosophy pointed a way back to a religion imposing no obligations. Hence, Schopenhauer repeatedly invokes the atheistic character of Buddhism. 126. Hence, he stresses that in the decisive question of original sin, the morality deriving from his atheistic philosophy is, if new and unfamiliar in expression, anything but that in essence, being in full agreement with the authentic Christian dogmas. 127. Hence, he denounces Hegel as actually a bad Christian. 128, and so on. Again, serving as a model for decadent developments later, there came into being that religious atheism, which assumed, for a large section of the bourgeois intelligentsia, the function of the religion which had become intellectually untenable among this class. Here again, of course, Schopenhauer did not round something off, but only paved the way. His social starting point in the Restoration period dictated the fact that his atheism, like the religion of this era, inculcated a social passivity, a mere turning aside from social action, whereas his later successors, above all Nietzsche and the subsequent fascists, expanded these points of departure morally in the direction of an active militant underpinning of imperialist reaction, which again ran parallel to the course taken by the churches in the imperialist world wars and civil wars. The complex stratification of capitalist society and the harsh changes in the course of the imperialist period. Class struggles necessarily meant that religious atheism during this age could, without needing to hark back directly to Schopenhauer, have quietist variations as well, e.g., Heidegger's existentialism. The strength of these parallels in social function between Schopenhauerian atheism, political reaction, and the positive religions and their churches is most clearly manifest in his discourse on religion. Schopenhauer begins with a sharp critique of the historical role of religions, leveled primarily at the intolerance of the monotheistic ones. But he concludes his dialogue thus, Philolithes. Certainly the matter appears in a different light if we take into account the usefulness of religions in supporting the crown, for as long as heads are crowned by the grace of God, altar and throne have a clearly defined relationship. And accordingly, every wise prince who loves his throne and family will always set his people an example of true religiosity, just as even Machiavelli urgently commends religiosity to princes in his chapter 1:8. Moreover, one could state that the revealed religions bore the same relation to philosophy as divinely appointed sovereigns bore to the sovereignty of the people. And for that reason, the two primary terms of this equation were natural allies. Oh, don't you adopt that tone. Consider rather that you would then be sounding a fanfare for ochlocracy and anarchy, the arch enemy of all law and order, all civilization and humanity. You are right, it was just sophistry. I therefore take it back. 129. All this provides a clear outline of the social function fulfilled by Schopenhauerian philosophy. This function also mind its philosophical problems in the narrower sense. Its methodological and systematic significance can only be understood when we see how its social terminus ad quem was constituted in reality. For only by ascertaining this can we define Schopenhauer's stance towards the history of classical German philosophy and his place within it, the authentic philosophical character of the irrationalism he founded. It is a well-established fact that on all crucial philosophical questions, Kant occupies a shifting, equivocal position. With matchless lucidity, Lenin characterized Kant's position between materialism and idealism as follows. The basic feature of Kantian philosophy is the reconciling of materialism and idealism, a compromise between the two, a systematic binding together of heterogeneous, mutually contradictory philosophical orientations. When Kant assumes that something outside of us, something in itself, corresponds to our ideas, he is a materialist. When he states that this thing in itself is unknowable, transcendent, and from the beyond, he is making an idealist stand. By acknowledging experiences and sensations as our sole source of knowledge, he gives his philosophy a bent towards sensualism and beyond sensualism, under specific conditions, to materialism as well. By acknowledging the a priority of space, time, causality, etc., Kant gives his philosophy an idealist bent. 130. In this crucial respect, the whole of German classical philosophy marks a mad step backwards in relation to Kant. Fichte already purifies, to use Lenin's term, Kantian philosophy of its materialist fluctuations and creates a purely subjective idealism. Schopenhauer's epistemology was always moving in this direction. It too, as we are about to see, reduced Kant's fluctuations to Berkeley's consistently subjective idealism. But Kant's position was variable and provisional not only as regards this question, a crucial one for philosophy in general, but also on the question of dialectics. The contradictions which became manifest in mechanical metaphysical thinking at the end of the 18th century come to a head with Kant. His comprehension of contradiction as a point of departure, as a logical and epistemological basis, is a tendency to be found throughout his oeuvre, although never taken to its conclusion or consistently worked out. Granted, with Kant all these preliminary moves still end in the reinstatement of metaphysical thinking and in a philosophical agnosticism. But we know from our discussion of the young Schelling how important even these inconsequential moves became as starting points for the development of dialectics in Germany. With Schopenhauer's position regarding materialism, we are already familiar. Here it is just a matter of showing that Schopenhauer's purifying of Kant's materialist inconstancies, his reduction of Kantian to Berkeleyan epistemology, not only marks the establishing of a consistent subjective idealism, but also implies a striving to eradicate all dialectical elements from Kantian philosophy and to replace them with an irrationalism based on intuition, with an irrationalist mysticism. Thus, while Schopenhauer's and Fichte's tendencies are in total conformity from the standpoint of the crucial epistemological question, the division of idealism and materialism, they are equally contrasted in the question of dialectics. In this respect, Fichte's subjective idealist view of the relation between ego and non-ego was an attempt to extend Kant's dialectical tendencies more logic ally. Hence the important role played by Fichte in the origin of the young Schelling's objective idealist dialectics. Hence Schopenhauer's sharply dismissive attitude to classical German philosophy's dialectical efforts in their entirety, even though his system shows many a point of contact with the irrationalist tendencies ever present in Schelling, and even though he borrowed a thing or two from Schelling in this field, without of course admitting it. In his critique of Kantian philosophy, Schopenhauer investigates the central problem of consistent subjective idealism in a very determined manner. He charges Kant above all with not having deduced the merely relative existence of the phenomenon from the simple, so apparent and undeniable truth, no object without subject, so as to portray the object as dependent on the subject from its very root, as determined by the latter, and hence a mere phenomenon which does not exist in itself unconditionally, because it will always exist only in relation to a subject. 131. He formulated the same idea even more firmly, if any, thing, in his first book, on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason. Just the object is posited with the subject, and likewise the subject with the object, and to be a subject is therefore tantamount to having an object. And to be an object tantamount to being known by the subject. In exactly the same way, the subject is posited along with an object, determined in any way knowing it in just that way. To that extent, it does not matter whether I say that objects have such and such determinants pertinent and peculiar to them, or that the subject perceives in such and such ways. It does not matter whether I say that objects are to be divided into such classes, or that such differing powers of recognition are peculiar to the subject. 132. In this respect, then, Schopenhauer goes back firmly to Berkeley and defends him against Kant. That important thesis to whose merit Kant did not do justice, Berkeley had already made the keystone of his philosophy, thereby creating a lasting memorial to himself, although he did not himself draw the appropriate inferences from the thesis, and was consequently partly not understood, and partly not sufficiently heeded. 133. Hence he rejected the second, revised edition of the Critique of Pure Reason as a falsification of Kant's true tendencies, and always adhered to the first edition when interpreting Kant. This sharp contrast which Schopenhauer drew between the first and second edition of Kant's magnum opus has played a major part in Kant Philology, Part 134. But the crucial question has to do not with philological history, but with philosophy. We have noted how Schopenhauer viewed Kant's relationship to Berkeley. Now, Kant wrote in the preface to the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason that he had added a refutation of idealism, which he justified thus. However innocuous idealism may be considered with regard to the basic purposes of metaphysics, it is still scandalous for philosophy and universal human reason to have to accept merely on trust the existence of things outside of ourselves, and should anyone happen to cast doubt on this, not to be able to answer with any satisfactory proof. 135. Thus what Schopenhauer regarded as Kant's great, though inconsistently sustained philosophical feat, Kant himself termed scandalous for philosophy. This firm adoption of the course of Berkeleyan subjective idealism would in itself ensure Schopenhauer the place of an important forerunner in reactionary bourgeois philosophy. For when Mach and Avenarius adopted Berkeley's epistemology afresh, just as fully in essence but using a much more veiled form of expression, they continued along lines which started with Schopenhauer. Lenin, too, ascertained the affinity in his Mach critique. One is above not only materialism but also the idealism of any old Hegel, yet not averse to flirt-ing with an idealism in the spirit of Schopenhauer. But in two respects Schopenhauer outstripped his successors. On the one hand, he supported unreservedly Berkeley's solipsistic subjectivism and idealism. It was still wholly alien to him to mask his idealism as a third road between idealism and materialism, as an elevation above this antithesis. On the other hand, he did not content himself, like Mach and Avenarius, with a mere agnosticism, but developed that mysticism and irrationalism inherent in all consistent idealism overtly from it with thoroughgoing logic. In this, likewise, he came nearer to Berkeley than to his own successors. There is, admittedly, the important historical difference that his development of subjective idealism merges it not with Christian religion, as Berkeley's did, but with the religious atheism we have previously noted. Now, in order to find an epistemological rationale for this, Schopenhauer does not repudiate the existence of things in themselves in general, but simply puts an irrationalist mystical interpretation on them by equating the thing in itself with the will, exaggerated and mysticized irrationalistically. He wrote, "Phenomenon means idea and nothing further. All idea, of whatever kind, all object is phenomenon. But the thing in itself is will alone. As such, it is never idea, but different from idea toto genere. It is that of which all idea, all object, constitutes the manifestationen, the visible nature, the objectivity. It is the most intrinsic element, the core of each separate entity and equally of the whole. It appears in every blindly operating force of nature. It appears also in man's deliberate actions. The great difference between the two concerns only the degree of manifestationen, not the essence of what is manifesting itself." 37. Thus Schopenhauer, like Schelling previously, presents us with two diametrically opposite modes of comprehending reality, an inessential reality and a genuine, essential one. But as we have seen, the young Schelling rejected with this conjunction only conceptual knowledge of reality. With his intellectual intuition, he was striving to comprehend, albeit in a confusedly mystical manner, the essence of the same reality, the motive forces of evolution as a universal principle behind all reality. Schopenhauer, on the contrary, automatically discredited all scientific knowledge and created a far deeper rift between knowledge of the phenomenal world and that of the thing in itself than Schelling did, even in his later period when he opposed positive to negative philosophy. For here we are dealing with two different kinds of reality, or rather with reality and non-reality, and the difference between these is exactly reflected in the two kinds of cognition. In part, this is connected with their different epistemologies. Schelling was an objective, Schopenhauer a subjective idealist. For Schelling, in consequence, the objectivity of reality is still somehow present, although in a form that was growing more and more distorted through mystical irrationalism. His early conception of the identical subject-object, especially, is a mystificatory form of expressing the notion that human consciousness is, on the one hand, the product of natural evolution, and that, on the other hand, the achieving of this identity in intellectual intuition implies a knowledge, an elevation of this objective natural process into self-consciousness. With Schopenhauer, however, the association between subject and object is constituted quite differently from the outset. We have already quoted Schopenhauer's statements in this regard. They culminate in the thesis that there can be no object without subject, and that what we call reality is identical with our ideas. He therefore identifies himself with the Berkeleyan es est, percipi. From this it follows that for Schopenhauer, as later for Mach, Avenarius, Poincaré, etc., the external world cannot have any real objectivity that is independent of human consciousness. That cognition, this too agrees with Machism, possesses only a purely practical significance in the struggle for existence, the preservation of the individual and the species. Therefore, knowledge in general, Schopenhauer wrote, rational as well as merely intuitive, proceeds in the first place from the will itself and belongs to the essence of the higher stages of its objectivation as a mere mechanism, a means of preserving the individual and the species as much as every bodily organ. Originally determined, then, to serve the will and to accomplish its purposes, it remains entirely the servant of the will almost continuously. This is the case in all animals and in nearly all human beings. 138. Without further ado, Schopenhauer was able to deduce from this epistemological viewpoint that, in the case of phenomena, the mode of comprehension thus determined is incapable in principle of telling us anything about their essence. He divided knowledge of the external world into morphology and etiology. Of the former, he said, "This presents us with innumerable shapes for our ideas, infinitely manifold and yet related through an unmistakable family resemblance, shapes which off this plane remain strange to us, and if regarded simply from this angle, look like baffling hieroglyphs. Etiology teaches us that according to the law of cause and effect, one particular state of matter gives rise to the other, and has thereby accounted for it and done its task. But this will not have affected our knowledge of objective reality." Schopenhauer sums up his epistemology as follows: "But this does not enlighten us in the least about the inner essence of any of those phenomena. This is led natural force and lies outside the realm of etiological explanation, which gives the name of natural law to the immutable constancy of the occurrence of such a force's externalization, as long as the conditions it knows are present. But this natural law, these conditions, and this occurrence in respect of a particular place at a particular time, are all that it knows and ever can know. The actual force externalized, the inner essence of the phenomenon occurring, according to those laws, will remain forever a mystery, quite strange and unknown, in the case of both the simplest and most complex phenomenon. In consequence, even the most thorough etiological explanation of the whole of nature would actually never be anything beyond a catalogue of inexplicable forces, and a reliable list of the rules whereby manifestations of those forces occur in time and place, succeed and give way to one another. It would, however, have to leave the inner essence of the forces manifested forever unexplained, because the law it obeys does not go that far, but stops with the phenomenon and its classifying." 139. Here we can distinctly see both the purely bourgeois character of Schopenhauer's epistemology and the energy with which it anticipates irrationalist philosophy's later development. Schopenhauer's close contact with 18th-century English philosophers, with Berkeley and Hume, stems chiefly from the fact that they were trying to meet the ideological needs of a bourgeoisie which had already gained control economically, by means of a compromise with the land-owning class and the religious views of the old regime. For that reason, they tried to create an epistemology which did not, on the one hand, obstruct the free development of natural science, indispensable to capitalist production. On the other hand, the epistemology they were seeking repudiated all philosophical consequences of scientific developments liable to hamper the compromise made with the ruling powers of the ancient regime by a bourgeoisie mostly inclining to reaction. This attitude's purely bourgeois character is manifest in the fact that the decisive argument for banishing such consequences is once again an indirect one. They are not dismissed because they fail to agree with Christian dogmas, but on account of their unscientific nature, and because they cross frontiers defined by epistemology as impassable for the intellectual apprehension of the phenomenal world. Schopenhauer's anticipatory character, his genius, is indicated by the fact that he recognized this trend of bourgeois development in backward Germany at the start of the 19th century. That in the political unawareness, socially, matters still stood quite differently. Of the German bourgeoisie of his age, he clearly surmised and raised to a high stage of generalization tendencies which only gained the upper hand in Germany and right across the continent after the defeat of the 1848-9 revolution. As we have seen, this knowledge of the phenomenal world could only possess, in Schopenhauer's opinion, a practical pragmatist significance. He now countered it with apprehension of the essence of things in themselves, apprehension of will. At this point, the irrationalist mysticism in his philosophy becomes fully evident. Even for the mode of perceiving the phenomenal world, Schopenhauer stresses the outstanding role played by intuition. Schelling's intellectual intuition, which, as we know, was for him solely the mode of knowing things in themselves, in sharp contrast to that of perceiving phenomena, he made a universal principle governing every kind of knowledge. Accordingly, our everyday empirical intuition is an intellectual one, and to this is due the predicate which Germany's philosophical windbags have attached to a purported intuition of imagined worlds, in which their favored absolutum performs its evolutions. 140. Naturally, this irrationalist principle of intuition makes an even bolder appearance in knowledge of the thing in itself, the will. Apprehension of this will occurs, as regards each man as an individual, purely intuitively and directly, as something, namely, which is directly known to that everyone, which the word will denotes. 41. That this entails a complete solipsism, a denial of the reality of our fellow men and the external world in general, Schopenhauer can contest only with sophistry and the tools of Schelling's philosophy, the philosophy he otherwise challenges so strongly. We judge the existence of our fellow beings, Schopenhauer says, according to the analogy of that life, T142, that is, according to our own, and in both instances we distinguish between idea and will. The same method is then used to apply the will by analogy to the entire phenomenal world as to its underlying being in it, elf. Schopenhauer expounds this analogizing, this extension of human will to the whole cosmos as follows. It must, however, be observed that here, all we need is a denominatio posteriori through which, for that very reason, the concept of will is expanded further than before. Perception of the identical in different manifestations and of the incongruous in similar ones is, as Plato so often comments, the very precondition of philosophy. Until now, however, we have not recognized the identity, with the will, of the essence of every single force straining and operating in nature. Hence, we have not regarded the manifold phenomena as the different species of the same genus which they are, but have taken them for heterogeneous. That is also why there could not be a word to denote the concept of this genus. Hence, I give the genus the name of its most admirable species, a nearer immediate knowledge of which leads us to indirect knowledge of all other species. 143. This analogizing, needless to say, again occurs in an intuitive way, on the basis of direct knowing. Bouve the word will, which is supposed to reveal the innermost essence of each thing in nature like an open sesame, by no means esnifies an unknown quantity, something that is reached by drawing conclusions. It signifies rather something which is directly perceived and so well known that we know and understand what will is far better than anything else, whatever. Hitherto the concept will was subsumed under the concept force, but I do the exact opposite and ask for every force in nature to be conceived as will 144. So here Schopenhauer anthropologizes the whole of nature with the help of plain analogy, which he loftily declares to be myth and hence truth. Here we are neither able nor disposed to analyze in all its details the philosophical system which arose in this way. We shall only indicate those crucial elements in which the new Schopenhauerian irrationalism, which had a tremendously strong bearing on 19th century philosophy, found expression. From Schopenhauer's return to Berkeley as we have traced it so far, it necessarily follows that for Schopenhauer, space, time, and causality are purely subjective forms of the phenomenal world and can never be applied to things in themselves, to will as Schopenhauer grasped it. Kant's fluctuating position derived from the fact that here he was similarly striving for a sharp dichotomy, but was forever trying to escape from the prison of this metaphysical dualism in the course of his concrete accounts. These steps taken by Kant towards a dialectical view of phenomenon and essence were mostly hesitant and equivocal. Schopenhauer radically abolished them and used the dualism, carried through in a more consistently metaphysical anti-dialectical argumentation, to bring about a total irrationalization of the world of things in themselves. Let us take an important case in natural philosophy. Force itself, Schopenhauer said, lies right outside the chain of causes and effects, which presupposes time by having meaning only in relation to it, but the former also lies outside time. The particular mutation is always an equally particular variation, but not so the force, on the cause whose externalization it is. For just that which always gives a cause its efficacy, however many times it occurs, is a natural force, and as such groundless, i.e., it lies right outside the causal nexus and the domain of the principle of reason, and is perceived philosophically as immediate objectivity of the will, which is entire nature's ln itself, 145. Thereupon, the whole of nature is turned into a mystery, although all the particular mutations needed for capitalist praxis may be comprehended in terms of causal laws and used in production. RUT philosophically speaking, everything is inexplicable and irrational. It is as inexplicable to us that a stone should fall to the earth as that an animal should move. And by pursuing this idea to its logical conclusion, Schopenhauer arrived at findings very close to the reaction-airy mysticism of imperialist natural philosophy, which they anticipate in methodology. Let us remember, from Spinoza's deterministic statements, that a stone flying through the air, if it had consciousness, would imagine that it was flying of its free will, a graphic image to illustrate the illusion of free will. As has been shown, we find analogies of it in Bayle and Leibniz as well. Schopenhauer similarly refers to Spinoza's image, but completely reverses its philosophical meaning by adding that the stone would be right. The push is the same for the stone as the motive for me, and what is manifested in the stone's case as cohesion, gravity, persistence in the assumed state is, in esoteric essence, the same as that which I recognize in myself as will, and which the stone too would recognize as will, were it to acquire perception. 147 Schopenhauer, of course, was not familiar with today's bourgeois atomic physics, but he would surely have assented enthusiastically, at least from the methodological angle, to the acausal movements of electrons and free will in the movement of particles. The results of this metaphysical irrationalist splitting asunder of phenomenon and essence emerge even more clearly in the human world. Since Schopenhauerian will lies beyond the operational field of space, time, and causality, and since he regards the individuation principle as thereby dissolved, every will is identical with will itself. This has very important human consequences. Only the inner processes, as far as they concern the will, have true reality and are real events, because will alone is the thing in itself. In each microcosm, there lies the whole macrocosm, and the latter contains no more than the former. Multiplicity is phenomenon, and the external processes are mere configurations of the phenomenal world, hence possessing no direct reality or meaning, which they only have indirectly through their relation to the will of individuals. This, therefore, is not merely to say that it is exclusively the inner factor which counts in every deed. That is also implied in Kant's categorical imperative, albeit with the important difference that Kant was always striving to give his pure abstract ethics a social content as well, and in order to achieve this, he did not flinch from sophistic methods, from an unconscious abandonment of his own methodological starting point. With Schopenhauer, on the contrary, we are dealing with inwardness, pure and simple, with the philosophical and ethical devaluation of every action, every real deed. But over and beyond this, the identity of macrocosm and microcosm, of the essential world, and the pure inwardness of the individuum is also implied in the passage just quoted. Certainly the path to this is an ascesis, a dismissal of the cruelties of existence, a vision of the inner identity of all beings, and therefore a surmounting of ordinary egotism. On all these issues, Schopenhauer speaks in a wide-ranging, picturesque, and often witty manner. But we must never forget that, again in abrupt contrast to Kant, and indeed to all the genuine moralists of the past, he regards his own ethics as optional for the philosopher, expounding and justifying them. Why then should they be obligatory for his readers and followers? But if they are not so, all that these sublime ethics leave us with is the inflation of the individual to a cosmic potency, plus a philosophical carte blanche to look down on all social activity in a superior way. This side of Schopenhauer's philosophy is further reinforced by the most popular part of his system, his aesthetics. Here again, bourgeois historians blur the picture by discerning in Schopenhauer's aesthetics a continuation of German classicism. In fact, they are the exact opposite. The aesthetics of Goethe and Schiller, those of the young Schelling and the mature Hegel, held art and knowledge to be two significant, mutually coordinating forms of comprehending the world. Goethe wrote, "The beautiful is a manifestation of secret, natural laws which, without the appearance of the beautiful, would be forever hidden from us." 149. On the face of it, Schopenhauer's aesthetics, with their connection between Platonic ideas and aesthetic contemplation, and their view of music as a reflection of the will itself, 150, come very close to this view. But let us not forget that in German classicism, knowledge and art were oriented to the same reality, and that they both sought in it different but converging solutions for the same dialectic of phenomenon and essence, whereas Schopenhauer defined art precisely as the mode of considering things independently of the principle of reason. Thus, with Schopenhauer, in contrast to German classicism, knowledge and aesthetic contemplation form diametrically opposite poles. Despite an equally superficial and deceptive resemblance, an antithesis just as sharp obtains in the relation of the aesthetic sphere to praxis. We do not need to expatiate on the fact that in classical aesthetics, from Kant's Without Interest, Schiller's aesthetic education, there exists a strong element of artistic isolation, an element of escape from social reality and praxis. But this was still only one element. Even aesthetic education was originally designed as a preparatory stage, as one phase in the education of mankind in social action. Only with Schopenhauer does this escape become the central problem of aesthetics. Here too, Schopenhauer was an important forerunner of Europe's later decadence. For such a total flight from social action is inextricably linked with the distortion of man which this aesthetic attitude occasions, whereas German classicism's aesthetic ideal was the normal human being. Schopenhauer posits an essential, intimate link between pathology and artistic excellence. For him, the genius is no longer nature's darling, as for Kant, 152, but a monstrum per excessum, 153. Here we find the reactionary irrationalism of the late bourgeois development, anticipated in embryonic form. This anticipation takes on grotesque overtones if we briefly touch on the stance which the atheistic Schopenhauer adopted to those problems which later gained popularity among the decadent bourgeoisie in such diverse forms as depth psychology, occultism, and so on. Thomas Mann has rightly pointed to the connection between Schopenhauer and Freud. One, but more important, is Schopenhauer's standpoint regarding the problem complex of clairvoyance, spiritualism, etc. To these questions, which were also very important for the reactionary romantics, he devoted a detailed separate study, which, needless to say, we cannot now examine at length. The important thing is to establish that Schopenhauer's subjective idealist epistemology offered a philosophical foundation for all such superstition. Thus Schopenhauer wrote of clairvoyance that it would lose at least its absolute incomprehensibility if we carefully consider what a mere cerebral phenomenon the objective world is, as I have so often said, for it is this phenomenon's laws and principles, resting as they do on space, time and causality, which are eliminated to some extent in somnambulistic clairvoyance. After briefly recapitulating his doctrine of the subjectivity of time, Schopenhauer continues, "For if time is not a condition of the authentic essence of things, then in respect of this essence, before and after are without significance. Accordingly, then, it must be just as possible to perceive an event before it has happened as afterwards. All divination, whether in dreaming, somnambulistic foresight, second sight, or whatever, consists only in locating the way to liberate knowledge from the condition imposed by time. That means that we must concede a real influence by the dead on the world of the living to be also possible, seldom though it may occur, and so on." 156. This dual tendency, an agnosticism towards real natural phenomena and natural principles on the one hand, and a blind credulity in assessing occult phenomena on the other, only becomes a widespread ideology in the second half of the 19th century. At the turn of the 1870s, 1880s, Engels criticized strictly empiricist English natural scientists for such tendencies and summed up his characterization thus: "Here it is palpably evident which is the surest road from natural science to mystification. Not the rank theory of natural philosophy, but the very plainest axiom that despises all theory and distrusts all thought." 157. But since Schopenhauer went much further than the English empiricists in dethroning reason, his true direct succession in this respect did not evolve until the imperialist age. The dual epistemological tendency is clearly visible in Simmel, for instance, and methodologically, it later played an important part in the projection of myths up to fascist racial theory. Hence the breeding of an irrationalist megalomania among the bourgeois intellectuals. It was aggravated by the fact that Schopenhauer not only took over the aristocratic character of Schelling's epistemology, but also extended it in a radical way. He too found that ordinary, conceptually discursive knowledge was available and comprehensible to anyone who only has reason. The comprehension of the world as it really is, as it objectifies itself in art, is a different matter. This is attainable only for the genius, and also someone in an inspired state by virtue of a raising of his pure apperception, a process which is mostly induced by the works of the genius. The artworks in which this being in itself appears are so constituted that they must remain books forever closed and inaccessible to the dull majority of men, with a wide gulf separating them, just as the society of princes is closed to the rabble. We have briefly outlined how Schopenhauer's rigorous irrationalism grew out of H's reduction of Kant's inconstancies to Berkeley's solipsism. It just remained for us to demonstrate, with regard to several philosophically crucial problems, how this irrationalism, as a backlash, meshes with the development of dialectics. How, in this respect, Schopenhauer's philosophy is pervaded by a wholly conscious struggle against dialectics, and how it substituted a mystico-metaphysical irrationalism for the advance of dialectical knowledge. Schopenhauer's conscious and bitter hostility to Fichte, Schelling, and above all Hegel is known to us from the history of philosophy. But the sharp theoretical antithesis of dialectical and metaphysical thinking, which in fact separates the two parties, has scarcely ever received concrete elaboration. And precisely this side of the subject has great significance for the development of irrationalism. Not only because, as we have repeatedly explained, every important phase of irrationalism originates in the antithesis to a stage in the development of dialectics. It is important also because every irrationalism requires, as a logico-epistemological complement to and underpinning of metaphysical thought, the appeal to a logical formalism. Without having referred expressly to the problems of dialectics before, we were nonetheless obliged in substance to mention some of the most important dialectical problems. Let us recall the relat 10 of phenomenon and essence, the inward and the external, theory and praxis. The sharp CBN-trast will at once be evident from even a cursory glance at the development of dialectics from Kant to Hegel. With Hegel, the dialectical relativizing of phenomenon and essence leads to a correct solution of the thing in itself problem, a knowledge of the thing through knowledge of its attributes, and the logical transformation of things in themselves into things for us in the course of a dialectical unending approximation to objects. With Schopenhauer, on the contrary, there is no mediation at all between appearance and essence, between phenomenon and thing in itself. They are two worlds radically divided from each other. Whereas for Hegel, the inward and the external continually interact. A metaphysical abyss separates them for Schopenhauer. We shall discuss in detail this question's anti-dialectical and irrationalist significance when we deal with Kierkegaard. With Hegel, theory and praxis are portrayed, as far as is possible in an idealist philosophy, in intimate dialectical interaction, so that theoretical category problems, such as that of teleology, are at once explained as deriving from human labor and the use of the tool. 159. But with Schopenhauer, theory and praxis are so inimical to each other that its relation to praxis is presented as a downright dishonoring of theory, an important symptom of the inferior and superficial character of praxis. Real theory and real philosophy must be pure contemplation strictly isolated from all praxis. This contrast becomes even clearer, if anything, when we consider the category of causality. We have already touched on this issue in the context of Schopenhauer's Berkeleyan solipsism and pointed out his extreme subjectivism, even in comparison to Kant. This aspect of the question is important for later developments, because Schopenhauer's radical stress on causality as, along with space and time, a unique category of the phenomenal world is in seeming contrast to tendencies emerging in the imperialist age. From the repudiation of causality by Mach and Avenarius, via its relativizing and enfeeblement in later thinkers, down to the substitution of probability calculation by present-day natural philosophers, viz., the advocates of physical idealism. In fact, however, this line marks a uniform trend to destroy the objectivity and objective principles of the external world existing independently of our consciousness. The common aim was to reduce to the subject the outer world's own coherent relations and to deprive them of any objective character. In this respect, Schopenhauer was, as we have already shown, an important forerunner and pioneer of the imperialist age's agnosticism and irrationalism. This is especially so because his concept of causality, precisely on account of the mechanical metaphysical exclusiveness of his fatalist determinism in the phenomenal world, served only as a springboard for reaching a totally irrational indeterminism, a total denial of any objectivity and laws in the area of things, in themselves. It is no accident, but a necessary consequence of Schopenhauer's interpretation of causality that one of the few older philosophers he revered was Malebranche, the founder of occasionalism. From the angle of the dialectical or metaphysical development of logic at the start of the 19th century, Schopenhauer's attitude to Kant on the causality question is of exceptional importance. Kant, as we know, set up a table of categories in which causality, although acquiring a key role in his concrete exposition, nevertheless forms only one of 12 categories he listed of the coherence of objects. All Kant's dialectical successors raised critical objections to this table, chiefly to the effect that its contents and composition were simply adopted from formal logic and that a philosophical deduction of its coherence had not even been seriously attempted. True, Hegel praises the great flair of the concept in Kant in his History of Philosophy, because the latter sought to arrange it in triplicate. But he censures Kant for not deducing these categories and simply taking them from experience with the adjustments they undergo in logic. 160. Thus Hegel was praising and censuring the extension of formal logic into dialectical logic, already discerning in Kant a precursor, albeit unclear and uncertain, of the dialectical method. Schopenhauer too criticized Kant's derivation of the categories, but in a totally opposite direction. His end was to destroy completely Kant's tentative steps towards dialectics. Whereas he saw in Kant's transcendental aesthetics an in or mouse achievement, namely a purely subjectivist conception of space and time, he regarded the transcendental analytics, the deduction of the categories, as completely obscure, confused, undefined, shaky, unsure. In his view, they contained mere assertions that it is thus and must be thus. Schopenhauer concluded his comments as follows. We may further remark that Kant, whenever he wants to illustrate a statement with an example, almost always resorts to the A category of causality, and what he has stated then turns out aright, and this is because the law of causality is the real and also sole form of understanding, while the other 11 categories are only blacked out windows. 161 about the causal nexus he adds, entirely in the spirit of this argument, of this real and sole function of understanding. 162 Schopenhauer took this sovereignty of causality so far as radically to reject any extension of it beyond the single mechanical chain of cause and effect. Thus he wrote, for instance, that the concept of reciprocity is, strictly speaking, empty. 163 that the effect can never be the cause of its cause, and hence the concept of reciprocity in its true sense is not admissible. 164 it is very interesting to compare this denial of reciprocity with Hegel's statements, which show in detail, on the one hand, the objective reality and effectiveness of reciprocity, but also see in it merely a relatively humble form of the universal dialectical bonds between all objects, a form, therefore, at which dialectical logic must not halt. Reciprocity, Hegel wrote, is, and this we admit, the closest truth of the relationship of cause and effect, standing, so to speak, at the threshold of the concept. But for that selfsame reason, we must not content ourselves with applying that relationship, insofar as knowing with comprehension is concerned. If we stop to consider a given content merely from the angle of reciprocity, the concept is in fact entirely missing from our act of considering. 165. Since here we are only concerned with elaborating the antithesis between dialectical and metaphysical irrationalist logic, we cannot now examine the very interesting details of this question complex. It will suffice as a summing up to quote some comments which Lenin made on dialectics and causality in Hegel, and to state that what he said about causality in neo-Kantian thinking also applies to Schopenhauer in its entirety. Lenin wrote, "If we read what Hegel says about causality, it will at first appear strange that he occupies himself so relatively little with this theme when it was so popular with the Kantians. What is the reason? The reason is that for him, causality is only one of the determinants of the universal coherence which he was already grasping earlier throughout his account in a considerably profounder and more universal sense, underlining this coherence, the reciprocal crossings and so on, constantly, and from the very outset. It would be most instructive to compare the birth pangs of neo-empiricism with Hegel's solutions, or rather his dialectical method. 666. With regard to the question of space and time, the contrast is equally clear-cut. Here, to be sure, there is far greater agreement between Kant and Schopenhauer than over the issue of the categories of understanding. For here, Kant was much less of a dialectician, at least in his endeavors. Not only did Kant, like Schopenhauer, regard space and time as universal a priori preconditions of all objectivity, and therefore as principles to be comprehended philosophically in independence of and prior to all objectivity, he also stressed their mutual total independence of each other. Schopenhauer throws this metaphysical dualism of space and time into even sharper relief. Thus we see that both forms of empirical ideas, although known to have infinite divisibility and infinite expansion in common, are still fundamentally different, in that what is essential to the one has no significance at all in the other. Juxtaposition has none in time, and succession none in space. If space and time appear united in practical understanding's knowledge, the principle of unification does not, in Schopenhauer's view, lie in space and time themselves, but exclusively in the understanding, in subjectivity. The young Hegel already took issue with Kant's metaphysical dualism on the matter of space and time, as in his Jena logic. The most striking aspect of this is that Hegel deals with space and time, not in the section concerned with epistemological logic, but in his book's natural philosophical section, in the chapter on the concept of movement. And even here, the theme is not discussed in epistemological isolation, but in connection with the question of ether. As regards the treatment itself, it should be stressed that space and time are presented, on the one hand, as elements of a concrete natural unity, and on the other, this automatically follows dialectically as interacting elements. The single like unto itself space is an element when isolated, but self-realizing as being what it is in itself, it is its own opposite. It is time, and vice versa, the infinite as the element of time. It realizes itself or is as an element, i.e., annulling itself as that which it is. It constitutes its opposite, space. With the mature Hegel, this question undergoes many vicissitudes, but the dialectical principles remain the same. In his encyclopedia, too, space and time are developed under natural philosophy, not logic, this time to be sure by way of an introduction to mechanics. Now, although Hegel as an idealist was still unable to find the real dialectic of space and time, he nevertheless regarded the inner compatibility, the ceaseless interaction of space and time, axiomatic. Here we cannot possibly give a detailed analysis of his views, but must limit ourselves to several examples which particularly characterize the method. In one passage, he writes, for instance, "The truth of space is time. Thus space turns into time. We do not pass into time subjectively, but space itself makes the transition. In imagination, space and time are far apart. We have first space and then time as well. Philosophy contests this as well." In 69, for Hegel, the dialectical thinker, then, Kant's dualism of space and time meant remaining stationary on the level of idea, a non-attainment of the philosophical standpoint. Hegel too constantly emphasizes the conceptual indivisibility of space and time from the real agitation of the world of objects. For him, space and time are never empty, and merely subjective vessels within whose frame objectiveness and movement occur, but are, on the contrary, themselves elements of the world of agitated objectiveness, the objective dialectic of reality. Thus, Hegel says of time, everything does not originate and expire in time, but time itself is this becoming, originating and expiring. Only on the face of it do these questions have an abstractly epistemological character. In reality, the mode of comprehending space and time crucially affects the construction of any philosophy. Let us remark just in passing that the sharp metaphysical division of space and time, which, with Schopenhauer himself, was still a mechanical juxtaposing, constitutes the epistemological hypothesis for the opposition of space and time in the irrationalist philosophy of the imperialist age. Here again, Schopenhauer appears an important initiator of irrationalism's later development, but he was only a forerunner once again. That slant so characteristic of the movement later, whereby mechanistic, fatalistic, dead, rational, and objective space was placed in antithesis to vital, irrationalist, truly subjective time, lay outside the scope of his thinking. And this was so for socio-historical reasons. It was only the fiercer class struggles of the imperialist age that forced this time conception upon reactionary bourgeois philosophy as the philosophical basis for a mythicizing pseudo-history intended to counter the increasingly victorious advance of historical materialism. Nietzsche, on the eve of the imperialist age, was likewise a transitional figure in this respect, although certainly on the basis of a Uter class struggles. His mythos was already a pseudo-history, but lacked a time theory of its own in the aforementioned sense, whereas Schopenhauer's mythos still consisted in a radical repudiation of all historicity. We again find the explanation for this in the class struggles of Schopenhauer's day and the ideological antithesis they promoted. We have already remarked in other contexts that during the period of Schopenhauer's activity, the ideological fronts were drawn up in opposition as historism and pseudo-historism. On the one side, there was the progressive bourgeois historical defense of progress, founded on the lessons of the French Revolution, and on the other, the semi-feudal legitimist doctrine of an organic development, which in fact implied an endeavor to revert to pre-revolutionary conditions behind the mask of historicity, and was thus the ideological defense of feudal legitimist reaction. On the surface, Schopenhauer's standpoint in this dilemma was a peculiar tertium datur, namely, a dismissal of the significance of all historicity for the essence of reality. But we have seen that this was antithetical to romantic reactionary philosophy, only in its argumentation and in specific concrete contents. In truth, Schopenhauer was likewise bitterly hostile to all social progress, with the sole difference that since he lacked inner ties with absolute monarchy and the nobility support in it, he did not mind which strong regime defended bourgeois property against the exploited masses as long as it did so efficiently. Only when regarded from this angle does the real philosophical meaning of the category problems we are discussing become clear. The change which classical German philosophy signifies in man's thinking rests not least on the fact that in objective idealism, Hegel's, above all, dialectics became, after major preparatory steps in the 17th and 18th centuries, the historical method for knowledge of nature and history. The subjectivist view of space, time, and causality, the restricting of their validity to the phenomenal world, the sovereignty of causality as the linking category of objects, the strictly metaphysical division of space and time, all this served primarily to repudiate in a radical fashion any historicity of nature and the world of men. Schopenhauer designed a world picture in which neither the phenomenal cosmos nor that of things in themselves knew change, development, or history. The former, to be sure, consisted of a ceaseless changing, an apparent becoming and expiring, a changing, moreover, that was subject to a fatalistic necessity. But this becoming and expiring was still static in essence, a kaleidoscope in which alternating combinations of the same components give the direct, uninitiated beholder the illusion of constant change. And anyone possessing real philosophical insight, Schopenhauer claimed, must be aware that behind this brightly colored veil of surface phenomena continually succeeding one another, there is hidden another world without space, time, and causality, a world regarding which it would be pointless to speak of history, development, or even progress. This initiated mind, wrote Schopenhauer, will not share people's belief that time produces something really new and momentous, that through it or in it something sheerly real will come into existence. It is here that Schopenhauer's animosity towards Hegel has its objective roots. Having converted Kantian philosophy into a radical anti-historicism, he then had to see Hegel's equally resolute dialectical historicism triumph over his system. Hence his doctrine largely took the form of bitter polemical imprecations directed against Hegel, as far, finally, as the striving to comprehend world history as an orderly whole is concerned, a striving encouraged by Hegelian quack philosophy with its universally corrupting and stupefying influence. Its actual basis is a coarse, humdrum realism which takes the phenomenon for the world's essence in itself and thinks that everything hinges on the former, its shapes and its processes. 172, it necessarily follows from this conception that Schopenhauer should deny any evolution in nature. In contrast to Goethe, with whom he purportedly agrees on every question, he was with regard to the natural sciences an admirer of Linnaeus and Cuvier, ignoring the attempts that his great contemporaries were making to discover a historical evolution in nature. Of course, not even he could fail to observe the gradations in nature, but he regarded them as perennial objectivation forms of the will, stages in the objectivation of the will, that were nothing else than Plato's ideas. 173. For him, these perennial prototypes of every individual phenomenal form were permanent, not subject to change, always being, never become. Here again, it is clear how vapid the conceptions were of those bourgeois historians who saw in Schopenhauer a continuation of Goethean traditions, and how they distorted any real connection. In all that crucially mattered about Goethe in terms of philosophy, in respect of his opposition to the unhistorical mechanicalism of Linnaeus and Cuvier, Schopenhauer was Goethe's adversary and not his heir. For Schopenhauer, therefore, history does not exist. For we are of the opinion, he wrote, that everyone is still infinitely far from a philosophical knowledge of the world who presumes it possible to grasp its essence in some historical way, however finely clothed. But that is the case as soon as any becoming or having become, or in the process of becoming, occurs in one's view of the world's essence in itself, and any earlier or later has the slightest significance. For all such historical philosophy, however superior its manner, takes time for a condition of things in themselves, though Kant had never existed, and hence stops at what Kant terms phenomenon as opposed to thing in itself. It is just knowledge which is accommodated by the principle of sufficient reason that never takes us to the inner essence of things, but only pursues phenomena into infinity, moving without purpose or goal. 174. In principle, said Schopenhauer, history can never become the object of a science. It is false not only in the exposition, but in its essence. 175. Hence for Schopenhauer there exists no difference in history between important and trivial, major and minor. Only the individual is real, whereas the human race is an empty abstraction. Thus only the individual, isolated in a world without meaning, is left over as the fateful product of the individuatine principle. An individual, certainly, that is identical with the world essence by virtue of the aforestated identity between microcosm and macrocosm in the world of things in themselves. This essence, however, located as it is beyond the validity of space, time, and causality, is consequently nothingness. Hence, Schopenhauer's magnum opus logically inks with the words, "Rather we freely acknowledge that what is left after the complete annulment of the will is for all those who are still full of will, assuredly nothingness. But conversely also, for those in whom will has turned round and denied itself, this very real world of ours with all its suns and Milky Ways is nothingness." But conversely also, for those in whom will has turned round and denied itself, this very real world of ours with all its suns and Milky Ways is nothingness. And at this point, with our survey of the most important problems in Schopenhauer's philosophy completed, we ask once again, what is the social task it fulfills? Or to put this question from another angle, what is behind its widespread and lasting influence? Here, pessimism is not by itself an adequate answer, for first pessimism requires. And at this point, with our survey of the most important problems in Schopenhauer's philosophy completed, we ask once again, what is the social task it fulfills? Schopenhauer's philosophy regs life in every form and confronts it with nothingness as a philosophical perspective. But is it possible to live such a life? If we consider Schopenhauer's philosophy as a whole, the answer is undoubtedly yes. For the futility of life means above all the individual's release from all social obligations and all responsibility towards men's forward development, which does not even exist in Schopenhauer's eyes. And nothingness as the pessimist outlook, life's horizon is quite unable, according to Schopenhauer's ethics already expounded, to prevent or even merely to discourage the individual from leading an enjoyable contemplative life. On the contrary, the abyss of nothingness, the gloomy background of the futility of existence, only lends this enjoyment an extra piquancy. Further heightening, it is the fact that the strongly accented aristocratism of Schopenhauer's philosophy lifts its adherents way above the wretched mob that is short-sighted enough to fight and to suffer for a betterment of social conditions. So Schopenhauer's system, well laid out and architecturally ingenious in form, rises up like a modern luxury hotel on the brink of the abyss, nothingness and futility. And the daily sight of the abyss, between the leisurely enjoyment of meals or works of art, can only enhance one's pleasure in this elegant comfort. This, then, fulfills the task of Schopenhauer's irrationalism, the task of preventing an otherwise dissatisfied sector of the intelligentsia from concretely turning its discontent with the established order, i.e. the existing social order, against the capitalist system in force at any given time. This irrationalism thereby reaches its central objective, no matter how far Schopenhauer himself was aware of it, that of providing an indirect apologetic of the capitalist social order. Kierkegaard,